In the last hours when Jesus spent with his disciples, when he was together with them in the garden, he repeatedly reminded them and warned them to watch, to pray, that they not enter into temptation. We see this repeated across all three of the synoptic gospels. It's recorded for us in Matthew 26:41, where he says, "Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." What he's telling them here is something that seems to serve as a bit of a callback or a reminder, as he's telling them to pray that they not enter into temptation. That likely sounds familiar because in the model prayer that he gave much earlier in his ministry, he also taught his disciples to pray in this way. And we see this in Matthew 6, verse 13. He told them to pray, "Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil." So in both of these passages, we see Jesus telling his disciples to pray that they not be led into temptation. So today we're going to look at this model prayer, the verse, or the specific verse and petition within the model prayer, to help see if we can get a better understanding of how we can incorporate this model prayer, this prayer to ask for protection from temptation. And we'll take a look both at some of the Greek words underlying that prayer, as well as how this instruction was conveyed during those last hours that Jesus spent with his disciples. But first, we're going to look at some of the Greek words underlying this verse in Matthew 6, verse 13. And the word that we commonly read in our English Bibles as temptation is the word perasmos, or perazo. And if you want the Strong's number, those are Strong's numbers 3985 and 3986. And to read the definition of this word, perasmos, from the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, it describes it both, number one, as either being an examination, to submit another to a test, to learn the true nature or character of someone. And the second definition it gives is a temptation, a trial given for the purpose to make one stumble. So we see that this word, perasmos, doesn't always mean temptation as we would typically think about it. It's not necessarily us being drawn or enticed towards something by our own lust. It can also be something that is brought upon us that we didn't ask for, but simply it is a matter of a test and a trial that we need to endure. So the meaning of this word really has more fullness than just understanding it within our modern frame of what a temptation is. So if we look to James chapter 1, verse 13, James does actually refer to this word, perasmos, in the context of how we would typically think of temptation. So if we read in James chapter 1:13, he writes, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust." So here, in this instance, this word perasmos, which appears in different forms 5 times just in those 2 verses of James, it does appear to be capturing this concept of temptation as we typically think about it, where we are drawn by our own lust towards something evil, potentially, or at least drawn towards a sin. And yet, this seems to be a different type of temptation than what Jesus was referring to in the model prayer. Because in the model prayer, we were told to pray that God not lead us into temptation, which seems to imply that sometimes God does lead us into a type of temptation, different from the one mentioned in James, but rather a type of temptation that is a test and a trial. And also, if we think about the verb that's being described in the verse, to lead us not into temptation, the word that's used for lead that we often read is the word eisphero, which means to bring in, to carry in, or to lead one to a state or event. That's as given again in the dictionary, Biblical Languages. So it seems to imply that God can actively bring us into this type of test and trial. If we read from the New Revised Standard Version, I think it has a bit of a better translation of Matthew 6:13, as it reads as this: "Do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one." So here, this translation is giving a broader picture of what peirasmos can represent, meaning a trial that God can and sometimes will bring us into. But are we then to pray that God not test us? That he not allow us to enter into any form of trial? Well, I think we're all willing to acknowledge and admit that it is healthy to have some degree of tests and trials in our lives. It is an important part of our growth. And yet, there's a certain type of testing that is perhaps too much. It seems to be that's what's alluded to here, that there is a degree of trial that we are not yet ready to handle. A trial in which God already knows we would fail if we had to measure up to it, if we had to face that in this very moment. So if we think about an example where if someone is trying to lift a really heavy weight, think about an Olympic athlete who is trying to lift more plates than we can imagine. They couldn't just will within their mind to do it and lift that weight unless they had been training and preparing for days, weeks, months, and years. And if they had tried to lift that weight and it was too much weight for them, they likely would tear their muscles or break their back. Well, if we take that same kind of analogy and apply it to our spiritual lives, there are certain trials and tests that if we were to face them today, in this very moment, they would also likely break us. We would be crushed under the pressure of that test. God knows what our breaking point is. So as part of our prayer, when we are asking him to not lead us into that trial, that severe test, we are asking him to not push us past our breaking point. If we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, the Apostle Paul writes, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." Here, Paul's not making any promises saying we will never be tempted or tested. But Paul is saying that through those temptations, God won't push us beyond what we can handle. That he will give us that way of escape, but we need to remember to reach out to God during those trials and during those tests to give us the strength that we need. And when it feels like it is truly too much, that is when we can pray for him to give us that escape. So if we then return to the story of the disciples in the garden, why was Jesus repeatedly telling them to watch and to pray that they not enter into temptation? He was worried for them because he knew they were not yet ready to face that ultimate trial, that ultimate test. He knew that they were still weak. If we read in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 35, we see Peter say this. Peter said to him, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." All the disciples said the same thing too. They were firm in their conviction. They were adamant about the fact that they would not deny their Messiah. They would not turn on him. But what did he say? Jesus said, "The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak." He knew that the apostles, his disciples, were adamant about their faith. But yet, that moment when they were tested, when they were physically tested and threatened, the physical side, that physical weakness, won over. So how then are we supposed to understand this passage where they were to be praying that they not enter into temptation? Again, Jesus was asking them to pray that they not be tested beyond what they were able. And we do know that ultimately, most of the disciples were killed. Many of them were martyred. They ultimately did end up facing that test and that trial when they were ready. But that night in the garden was not a moment in which they were yet ready. Their spirit was ready, but their flesh was still weak. So how then do we incorporate the model prayer into our own lives? How do we think about it? I think it's important to understand that this is not just a temptation that we are asking God to remove us from, but that we are understanding it as being a trial that is potentially severe, that would stress us beyond what we can handle today. So when we pray to God, we need to ask him to not test us beyond what we can handle, but that he would give us the strength, even when our flesh is weak, that he would strengthen our spirit, so that when we are ultimately tested, we would be faithful, and we would stand as faithful and loyal witnesses to our Messiah.